Wait. Oh.
This is not a show and might not even be a connection. Here's Judah and guest.
And we are live. This is not a show. Not even, it may not be a connection, but it is a conversation. I'm here with Michael Katuzis. Am I pronouncing it right, Katuzis?
You are. It's my name looks more intimidating than it actually is. It's pretty simple.
Yeah.
To this.
Well,
So.
you always kind of laugh too after I say it. So I'm like, uh-oh. I think it's because I need to put my last name. But anyways, and we got better sound. It sounds like I like the little. You got the headphones in. I'm gonna turn down my air so that we. Oh, got turned up actually, so that we have less sound in the background for me. And we are going to talk about a little thing I like to call, I gotta write it, the early church and socialism. And this comes up because I had a discussion, I mean, I'd say like a common friend of ours. We went to school with him, and I think he's a priest or something now, and he was talking about this. And it wasn't that it bothered me or anything. It's just something that I hear a lot. That the early church were socialists. So, Christian conservatives, get your head out of the sand, man. So, I mean, are we just old fuddy-duddies, man? Have we just gotten... Have we lost touch?
Lost touch with what the early church did? Is that what?
Yeah.
I would say
early
no.
church, but no?
No, I don't think we're out of touch here. I've heard, I've talked with John before, and this isn't the first time I've heard it. I mean, that argument. I've heard lots of Christians. Actually, when I was at Trinity, I heard that a bunch, and just since then, as socialism has kind of arisen on the national stage, you just hear it talked about more because a lot of Christians tend to reject it, and because it's rejected, you've started to hear Christians take stance with it and say, "Well, guys, that argument you've heard has started to move to the foreground. That no, the early church, if you look at Acts, they say that it went on and that it's not bad per se." And I actually think that on the surface, there might be some correlations, not correlations, but an appearance that there might be some of that going on. But when you look a little deeper, it's like, no, that's not at all what's going on. They weren't practicing socialism.
I'll be the first to say, and this may come as a shock to a lot of people, but I am 100% for communism. I believe in communism.
I don't. Anyway, go ahead. Go ahead. This is interesting. Go ahead.
Okay. I got some people's attention. Got your attention.
Yeah.
I believe in communism on a micro level. The fundamental idea. Now, sorry. Back up. I just mainly said that for shock value. The fundamental idea of a community, to me, works very well on a local and familial, especially communist organization than the family.
There's kind of a weird skipping. I'm not quite hearing you. It's coming in and coming out, and then yeah.
Okay,
go ahead.
I wonder if me or
I don't
program.
know.
Okay.
So you're talking about communism on a micro scale.
Yeah, on a microcosmic scale, I believe. So the family, to me, is a wonderful example of how communism works. But it works because it's kind of what we talked about last time. You hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear
coming through?
Yeah.
Okay. It's coming from it starts with personal property. It starts with the individual, starts with me,
Okay.
starts with my family, and works its way out rather than starts with the huge machine called national, American national government, which is the biggest government in the world, and works its way down and finally trickles down to me. That to me is evil. But working its way from me out to my family, to my neighborhood, my neighbor, my neighborhood, my town, my county, my state, like working it way that way. The closer it is in, the smaller it is. Communism is a good idea, in a general sense. In the sense, now with a caveat, right?
Okay.
That except for in my family, there is no forcing of anybody to share. And my dad brought this up because I brought it up at the dinner table today. My dad brought it up. I think it's a very important point. That is that in the Bible, there is obviously a communal emphasis, but there isn't the communal emphasis, the sharing at the end of a gun, right? We are not forcing anybody. And in the early church, nobody was forced to share. And I think that's a huge distinction, as today we're talking about, here you go, government. We want to outsource our ministry to you. Let give you our money and you take care of my neighbor. Thank you. Now I can do whatever I want. I don't have to feel guilty that I'm not taking care of my neighbor because I'm worshiping the Almighty. I guess they don't mind worshiping Trump. Let's give Trump our money. Give him our money. And because, like all that power that was given to Obama is now Trump's. So, they don't care who's in power, I guess. So, you wonderful machine that takes care of all 300 million people in our nation, you will be better at taking care of my neighbor than me. That's my problem with the globalized, in terms of the ubiquitous within our nation, socialism. I'm fine with, obviously socialism, the communal aspect, communism in its very bare form of the term, works fine in my family.
But is it communism? I would actually argue what's going on in your home is not communism, because you can't separate the ideal. I mean, if you look at communism, Karl Marx, the guy who came up with the idea, I don't think it's coincidental that it came from him. He was an atheist, rejected God, and so by rejecting God, you're rejecting providence, you're rejecting the things of God, love, compassion, mercy, all that type stuff. As being, because what's the greatest commandment according to Christ? It's to love the Lord.
Yourself.
Well, first it's to love God with all your mind,
love
soul,
God
right?
with all your mind.
And then love your neighbor as yourself.
My mind went there. Yeah,
no problem. Yeah. But you're there. You got part of it. So the problem that I see is when you reject God, you reject that. And his system is now that he created was a way to try to. And it's funny, interestingly enough, when you reject God, you reject the things of God. I don't think it's coincidental that he has this idea that man can share like that, and that it's all one big happy utopia. Communism doesn't take into consideration that man is evil, has a sin nature, a flesh, and so it's kind of this pie in the sky thing. And you got all these people saying peace, love, and everything will be great when we all get together, and then they realize people don't bend because they're arrogant, they're unloving, they're disloyal, they're ungenerous. They take advantage of their brother. And then what do? Eventually, you got to put a gun to their head to make them do what you want to do. But those same people get in positions of power who are greedy, unloving, power loving, and all that. And so then they'll make laws and do all sorts of things that are godless, and it becomes just a totally screwed up system. But that was an attempt, communism was an attempt to create a system where the government is, in essence, God. Like we've removed God as the one we go to, and government is now, we've elevated it in its place. And it's an abysmal failure if you look at wherever it's been applied. I mean, some people might say, "Oh, Chinese communism is working. It's kind of adjusted. It's brought in, it's adjusted to capitalism. Unlike the Russians, they're too idealistic. The Chinese communists are practical. Bring in capitalism." But there's so much corruption there, and again, apart from God, you got everything from Uyghur containment camps to political dissidents to organ harvesting to, abortions. They have these, all these laws, like you couldn't have but one kid, and then you had to pay, fines, because that's their way of controlling population and trying to establish themselves apart from God. And so I don't think it's coincidental that it's ugly. There's a cheap veneer, but when you get underneath it, you see how ugly it is. And I think that's why a lot of people do leave there and come here. The ones
well, and there is, I think there is a biblical. My actually brought up this other point. I think it's pretty good from Scripture, although it depends on how you look at the Old Testament. But he said there's a very clear acknowledgement, at least in the Old Testament, a very simple acknowledgement of personal property. Now, so
Yes.
the problem, one big problem with
Communism.
or socialism
Yep.
as well, is that they do not believe in personal property ownership. And it's in the Ten Commandments very clearly when you say, don't covet thy neighbor's, don't be covetous. And what was the other one? Can't remember the other one that he brought up. It's a reference to
I'm losing you.
personal belongings.
Can you hear me?
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, it's
Yeah?
starting to skip a little bit. All right, go ahead.
Sorry.
It might be on my side.
With COVID, I don't know. It just might be the internet in general, as
Everyone's streaming.
COVID. Everybody's on. Yeah, everybody's streaming, especially right now. Hamilton's playing. Everybody's streaming Hamilton
Before they take it off the air, because did you hear about that?
before they they cancel
Slave
it.
owner, get rid of it. It's like, okay. Anyway,
Yeah.
right. But yeah, there is a scriptural precedent for private property. I mean, even we
Oh.
are. Go ahead.
Sorry, the other one is thou shalt not steal. Obviously, you can't steal if you don't own anything. Like, that's right.
Yes.
Like it's actually stealing when government when anybody. Now I don't necessarily know if it's stealing per se from God's perspective when your family members take from you, but even there, it's to me, when people rail nowadays, people rail the idea of personal possession, and not just in the terms of like having something and owning something, but like in terms of being an individual in God. Well, if God believes in taking, and well, first of all, personal responsibility, I don't know how you can get away from individuality without, if there's no such thing as individuality, there's no such thing as personal responsibility. But look at verse about, his mandate not to be covetous and not to steal. And you could say, well, I think you have much harder stance than I do on the law, especially the Ten Commandments. I tend to be a little bit more cessationist when it comes to the Old Testament. Isn't the Old Testament has less to do with our daily lives now because of the freedom of Christ, but it still has to be taken.
Yeah, I mean, we don't follow the old
account.
laws, but there are you can't just throw out the Old Testament either. I mean, I don't know. I'll put it like this. I don't think that your family is a representative of communism as Karl Marx has laid it out. And I don't know. I mean, if communism isn't how Karl Marx laid it out, then it ain't communism. He's the one who developed the theory, the idea. There's governments that have tried to live it. Your family unit is one based on love, not force and authority and pushing. I mean, there is some overlap, but these are your flesh and blood. Your neighbor is actually technically flesh and blood as well, very distant. It's your fellow man who's created by God as well. And you give not out of compulsion, you give out of love. I think if you give out of compulsion, I mean, what is it? 1 Corinthians 13 says, if I give everything I own and to the poor and commit my body to the flames and have not love, I'm nothing. Nothing, yeah. Gain nothing. And so love has to be part of that. And I know in the go ahead.
But love can't a big important part of love is that it can't be compulsory, right? Like, an important thing about giving out of love is that if you're giving compulsion, if you're giving because somebody has a gun at your head, that's not love.
No, it's not love. It's don't kill me. So yeah.
And people can lovingly give their taxes, but there's something strange. Often people point to those verses as an example of why we should pay our taxes. Of course, there's a much better verse for that, but yeah.
Well, government has its place. It's God instituted. Kind of leads into our discussion from last week, but God did create it, and we are to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and to render unto God what is God's. But I feel like communism and socialism, because actually Lenin said socialism was just the transitional form from democracy to communism. That's how, if you look at the old communists, that's how they viewed it. Just, this is how you get there. It wasn't far enough. But socialism even arose out of a means of attempting to deal with life, provide for yourself, prosper yourself, deal justice and all that apart from God. It's fundamentally a humanistic ideal. It doesn't draw from the Bible because a lot of the things that are the motivations for doing it actively stands up against. And I don't think it's coincidence that communist and socialist governments tend to crack down on Christians. They inevitably see Christians as at best nuisances, at worst enemies, because God has instituted private property. There's even inheritances that go on. You had I'm trying to remember, all the males of this one family and during the Exodus period died. Not Exodus period, during the period of Israel, and you had inheritance passing on to the women, so that they would have an inheritance and all this.
Yeah.
Personal possessions. You had examples where personal possessions were taken, and it was evil. Ahab wanted a guy to sell him his familial lands, and he's like, "No, I ain't going to do it." And so his wife set him up with false charges, got him murdered, and then he just confiscated his land. Very communist, but that's a very Leninist way of doing things. But I'm not saying he's a communist, but acted like one a little bit. But long story short, what the wrong arose because he couldn't take the man's land. The land was given to him, and God expected it to, unless he sold it out of his own free will. Here, you can have it. It's his. To do with it as he will. Now, when I hear a lot of Christians talk, they're like, well, if you look at the early church, that's the Old Testament, look at the early church, and they usually tend to quote Acts. It's in Acts 2 and Acts 4. Acts 2 is, do you mind if I read it? Just so they know. Yeah. Acts 2 says, it's Acts 2 verses 42 through 47. It says, they were continually devoting themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone kept feeling a sense of awe and many wonders and signs were taking place through the apostles. And all those who had believed were together and had all things in common. And they began selling their property and possessions and were sharing them with all, as anyone might have need. Day by day, continuing with one mind in the temple and breaking bread from house to house, they were taking their meals together with gladness and sincerity of heart, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord was adding to their number day by day those who were being saved. There's another part. I'm sorry. Do you want me to read the other part?
Too? Yeah.
Okay. The other part, it says it's in Acts 4, verses 32 and then 34 and 35. It says, and the congregation of those who believed were of one heart and soul, and not one of them claimed that anything belonging to him was his own, but all things were common property to them. And then 34 and 35 say, for there was not a needy person among them, for all who were owners of lands or houses would sell them and bring the proceeds of the sales and lay them at the apostles' feet, and they would be distributed to each as any had need. So that's where that comes from, basically, the idea that it's socialism.
Well, and Marx says, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. And that's actually not a terrible... obviously, he went on to say much more than that, but that particular idea right there, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, is, I mean, I think I tend to apply that to my family, and I apply that to recently I've been working with young people transitioning to college and helping them sort of transition to the workforce and stuff like that. And there is an aspect of, we work on a lot of, like, instead of going to a interview thinking about what can I get from this employer, a better approach is how can I fit in, and what kind of value can I bring to this place of employment. And I think there's something profound in that statement, from each according to his ability, to each according to his from each according to his need, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. It's the problem is when it becomes compulsory. The problem is when we say when it becomes mandatory, right?
Well, then it's not love, yeah. And if the love is fulfillment of the law, then, if you're just doing it because it's compulsory, because you'll get in trouble, there's no love in that. And if love is the fulfillment of the law, you'll give because you actually care. Like, so, for example, communism arose, at a time when nations were growing huge. The idea of it, Marx in Europe, you had the industrial age, tremendous amount of wealth being created, very powerful people who didn't really care much for the poor, who used the poor, and governments were putting restrictions on behalf of the poor. You had religious, churches just, trying to basically condemn some of the stuff that they saw. But his response, I mean, he's an atheist, was that this needs to be stopped, and that people should. He kind of had this idea that we could all just kind of get along and get together and benevolent, but because he didn't realize that he's dealing with sinful people, then everything from there, anything he's trying to build on top of that is going to fall over. There's a few truths that he incorporated in that, but so you've got people that don't care, and the issue is they need to love. They need to care for the workers who work for them, and that care moves to generosity. That care moves to I'll give you an example. All right, I was watching something on Donald Trump not too long ago. When he had first gotten inaugurated as president, but they were going over some penthouse or something that he owned, and they had like gold lined sinks that were $120,000 a piece, like they were made of gold or something like that. Yeah, I'm just like, the sink that they use to wash their hands in after they go to the bathroom could pay off my student loans or could pay off a mortgage, And I think it's that kind of opulence. And it's not just Donald Trump. I mean, if you look at the wealthy, I'm sure Bezos has his, crystal, whatever, or Elon Musk or all these others, But Karl Marx was a response to seeing that inequality, but not inequality. What do we call it? The gap.
Disparity. Wealth disparity.
Yeah, wealth disparity. Now, what's interesting, actually, it's funny that you bring up wealth disparity, because being poor isn't bad. It's not even spoken of in bad terms in the scriptures. It actually says that the poor man should rejoice in his high position, and the rich man should rejoice in his low position. You're like, what? Well, how could that be true? Well, the poor guy can't just write a check for something. I found myself in this situation quite a bit, where we haven't had money, and it's literally like, okay, God save us or we break, we bust. It's not, I don't have it. And those are the times when you see God show up. But if you just write a check, you call your powerful buddy to get you out of trouble or whatever, you don't have to lean on God so much. There's even proverbs that talk about how money can get you out of trouble, and get you out of, it makes life smoother, I think, is even what Solomon said in Ecclesiastes. But when you look at poverty, it's not necessarily a bad thing. But the modern world looks at poverty as almost like an evil that must be eradicated. And I see, it's funny, you look at missions trips and they'll send our kids over there who have all this much, and they'll come back and they'll talk about these poor kids are so happy, and they're just so much joy to them, and we've got all this stuff, and it gave them pause and perspective, like, it isn't iPhones and DVDs and cars and nice clothes that bring joy and bring happiness. So I don't think that necessarily poverty is a bad thing. It can create, now being in want isn't good, but it actually enables, it creates things, opportunities for love to take place, where those who do have give because they care and are concerned for their brother or their sister.
Well, poverty, I would say, maybe change that a little bit. I would say that poverty isn't an evil thing. I mean, it kind of depends on your definition of bad, but it's definitely, it's definitely not comfortable, and it's definitely not, definitely, it is, suffering. And suffering, I don't ever want to say that suffering is good, but suffering isn't evil.
The scriptures say that Christ learned obedience by what he suffered. So if Christ, how much more us? So I actually think suffering, C.S. Lewis talked about in the problem of pain in his book, about how pain really and suffering can really be a refining factor in people's lives. And honestly, some of the most shallow people I've ever met are ones who've never suffered. They look down their nose, they can come down with all these cockamamie reasons on why this person's suffering, and they'll tell you, well, you just need to do this, this, and this. And yet, if they've ever been there, it's kind of like, okay, not quite so easy. And I just know this. I've seen a lot of people where suffering hasn't been part of their life. And a lot of times, wisdom doesn't tend to be part of their life as a result. And suffering, it kind of tempers you. It's if you seek to understand it. I'm not saying anyone who suffers is suddenly a guru or wise, but it can. It really, if handled correctly, it can really sharpen and temper you. And so, anyway.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that it's interesting that so often I just get caught up in pleasure, and I'm going to be talking more about this with Josh tomorrow, so I don't want to get too into it. But the importance of work and being uncomfortable. But one thing I wanted to come back to is this idea of love at with a gun pointed at you. And
I love that. Yeah, go ahead.
I think that it's ironic to me that there's such a huge, there's a huge push from the left to defund the police, while at the same time, they are so totalitarian in their approach to freedom, to liberty. So it's like, I saw one meme say, the same people that want to defund the police also want the police to force you to wear masks. But I mean, the same thing could be said. The same people that want you to defund the police are the people that want the police to make sure you pay your taxes.
Yeah.
And
That's why I don't believe it. I don't believe they want defunding the police. If you want my personal take, I think it's you're seeing leftists trying to overthrow a government, and they're going after the power keeper, the gatekeepers of the old government, military, police, that kind of stuff. Take those down, and then once they get in, they're going to establish their own. Communists did the same thing once Stalin and Lenin and all those guys got in
well,
charge.
we saw that. We saw them do that in what is it?
Chaz, the Chop, yeah.
Chop.
They brought out their guns and yeah, go ahead.
But I think it's an important point that that charity is impossible to institute. That's period. Charity is impossible to institute. You cannot. Well, you cannot institute it through a dictate, right? You can't dictate charity. It has to come from a place of the heart, and it has to come from a place of choice.
And see, that's why I'm sorry. That's why I think communism and socialism won't work. Because I'll read you a definition of socialism. You tell me where charity is in any of this. A various economic and political theory advocating collective or governmental ownership and administration of the means of production and distribution of goods. A system of society or group living in which there is no private property. A system or condition of society in which the means of production are owned and controlled by the state. So if the state takes from you to give to this person here, or it doesn't even leave room for charity, grace, mercy, that kind of thing. In fact, it actually even opens the door for evil, like theft.
Yeah.
I'm going to take this and give it to them against your will. And I'll put a gun to your head if you don't let me do it. That's bad.
Well, and it puts man, like you said, it reduces down to humanism in the sense that it puts humans, it puts man, and typically men. People talk about the patriarchy and what have you. It puts men in charge of who deserves and who doesn't, and who gets the who is needy and who isn't, and who gets the to benefit from mine and your
production.
What did you say? Yeah, production.
Yeah.
From abilities, and it doesn't. It's not an organic thing at all.
No.
Now, I think people would like to see it, but you just can't have that sort of thing organically happen over 300 million people. Is it million or billion? 300 million people, and
where in the U.S.?
So, yeah, in the U.S. Yeah.
Where? Here?
In the U.S. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, 360 million, I think. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I was off by 60 million, but yeah. So, the thing that sort of grieves me about Christians that really embrace people like Alexandria, what's her name, Ocasio-Cortez, and just real. And I understand where it's coming from, because they see, on the real far left, they see this idea of opening up space to help people, but to me, the part that really grieves me is sort of the, I don't want to say ignorance, but to me it looks like ignorance, and I mean, leave a comment in the section, leave a comment in the comment section below. Just correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a certain ignorance to me, believing that Jesus would have us give our money to this evil machine. Like, how can anybody look at our government and say, or look at it and say it can be good? We just have to put the right, how many people are in government? Maybe 30 million people in our government. Maybe we can get all 30 million people to be the right, quote unquote, good people, and they will make all the right decisions, and they will see that what my neighbor needs, and all I have to do is give a small portion. The more of us do it, the smaller it has to be. Like, to me, that's an argument against That's not biblical, right?
No, it's not. No,
We're not trying to give as little as possible. We're trying to
no,
give as
I,
much. We're trying to give as much as possible and as efficiently as possible. And I can't see how anybody can think, can even imagine, like these 30 million people in government will be able to, I don't know if it's 30 million, I'm just throwing out a number, but
yeah,
it's
whatever.
pretty big,
Yeah.
will be able to work together and take care of my neighbor better than I. Like each one of those people have to get paid. Every time you give $1 to the government, your neighbor's only getting like a pittance of that. So I don't understand the logic here. Now
Well, the
I'm
logic is it's an attempt to deal with the society's problems, ills, all the hardships of the world apart from God. That's what you're seeing. And
but
they're
there are good
trying,
Christians. There are good Christians that look at government and say we can get the right people in there.
explain, what do you mean? Like, I'm
In
saying good
in
Christians, you mean like,
in my experience, there are people that
flesh
love
it out.
Jesus, that love Jesus. I know they do. I know they
Okay.
love Jesus and they love their neighbor.
They
And
can
they
be wrong.
still, right, but it just boggles. And they're smart, though. They're smart. And they still in
Peter,
government. And
I don't know if you remember in Acts, but Peter actually joined the Judaizers for a period.
Judaizers.
Judaizers, yeah. And Paul actually had to go back and correct him, to get him back in line. And so
Yeah,
God loving, God fearing people can be wrong. You know,
I understand that. But how do we persuade them? I obviously it's hard to persuade them when I'm being asked, right? And I really have to work on stop being an ass, and maybe they see me as a jerk when I support somebody as jerky and ass faced as Trump, but I think people don't believe me or something when I tell them I love how Trump has become so piggish and so like just anti in his personal life and everything. He's just become so distasteful, and yet that's what you get when you get government. Like we're not trying to get a beautiful king, a wonderful conqueror as our leader in government. We're trying to get, we're just trying to get somebody who does things right. We're trying to get a really good secretary. And to me, Trump accomplishes both of those things by being so ugly on one sense and so efficient in another by putting the right people. But that's a conversation for a different time. I want to come back to this idea that there are, it's just how do we persuade people that we look at them and say, you are right. We need to help these people, but we don't help them by establishing a giant, the machinations of government to establish some kind of program for these people.
the way to do it is to bring them back to the Word. That's what Paul did to bring Peter out of his error. That's what we need to do. Show them in the Word, because I mean, man, the scriptures say that man's ways are not God's ways. God's ways are not man's ways.
Mm-hmm.
So we can come up with all sorts of things. I look back at my life. There's many things I thought God's stamp of approval was on it because I concocted it in my head and it seemed reasonable to me. And then I opened the Bible and I was like, wow, what seems so reasonable and just and fair? God said, no, it's not. In fact, it's evil. I'm like, okay, So we need to let the Bible guide how we see things. It's a lamp unto our feet and a light unto our path. And so I would say start there. It does eliminate the greater things that you see in the scriptures. If it's compulsive, love is removed. And if love is the fulfillment of the law, then it removes that aspect. It actually even, the disparity between the poor and the rich is looked upon as an evil. And yet the scriptures don't teach that at all. I mean, I know that sounds bad, but there are going to be saints in heaven. I mean, we can't take all this with it. Say Elon Musk becomes a Christian. Jeff Bezos becomes a believer. All the billions he owns ain't going with him. And he might be a pauper in heaven, based on how he's lived his life here. And there might be some poor guy who shows up to Waffle House, divorced, but seeking to honor the Lord, making a scratch of a living, treating customers with respect, honoring the Lord with his life, and he might be a king there, because he invested where moth and rust do not destroy and thieves do not break in and steal. That's what the scriptures say. He invested in the higher things, and store up for yourself treasures in heaven where moth and rust do not destroy. And so I feel like this whole approach of looking at things as money is the end all be all is actually a very worldly concept. And I know many Christians get caught up in it as well. And now it doesn't mean it's sinful to have money. David was rich, Solomon was rich, but it's not we can't worship both God and mammon, is what the scripture says. And, when God does give people, he blesses the work of their hands. And they do have extra, rather than build your third vacation home or be like Bill Gates, who had like a 30-something $million yacht that's as big as an ocean liner, maybe he should consider the poor. Those who, he talks about all this stuff. There's people who are drowning in student loan debt. There's people whose houses are about to go under and they need that to keep that roof over their head. How about rather than, God's blessed you, and then rather than pleasuring yourself and just putting your own business interests and all that forward, why don't you care about these little guys and help them up? That kind of thing. There's a scripture that says this. It's 1 John 3:16 through 17. I'm going to read it. We know love by this, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. But whoever has the world's goods and sees his brother in need and closes his heart against him, how does the love of God abide in him? Now, that should be what directs us. And when you do that, actually, what's funny? We're actually just stewards of what we have. The money we have, it's only because God's blessed our hands, but it's really his. He's given it to us to be stewards of, or to pay our bills, or we can do things with it. But if we take the money that he gives us and all we do is just build bigger rooms and castles and vacations and pleasure ourselves, that shows where our heart is. And our heart's in a terrible place if that's the place where we find ourselves.
Well, I guess the difficulty is I've seen people that have been super generous, but they're not complete. They're not very braggadocious about it, right? They're just like private. They're super generous, but they don't believe in government being generous. I mean, those things go hand in hand, right? If you don't believe the government being taking care of if you don't believe in outsourcing your generosity to the government, then obviously you're going to be generous. You should be generous yourself. But as soon as that person starts to espouse support for conservatives and the Republican ideals, then they get labeled. They get labeled as someone who is heartless, as somebody who doesn't care about the poor, who is somebody who doesn't care about the least of these. And
that's I think that's terrible for them to do, because then that's judging this person. I mean, they don't know what this guy's doing in his private life, it just shows how judgmental the people are looking at him just because he says, I don't think the government should do it. I think we should, guys. It's easier to just have the government take it for you by compulsion and then them handle it. You don't have to get involved in people's lives. You don't have to know what's going on. You don't have to. Sometimes you might actually give above and beyond maybe that trip you were going to do or that floor you're going to replace. I'm going to have a new tile floor. The old one's not bad, but I just want a new updated modern kitchen. Maybe you're helping someone else out who's hurting. That means more to people, I think. You show love like that.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off, my bad.
No, you didn't. You didn't. I appreciate you saying that, because that's what I was getting at. Is that now there are plenty of people that I know that do both. They wholeheartedly espouse the ideals of the left, while at the same time, and so give.
Being generous,
and they're also generous. They give abundantly to Trump, and they give I'd say that they give abundantly to the government, and and they give abundantly to the people around them. Um, do you think this is a question that just came to my mind? Is it? I don't know. We don't have very much time, but can Christians be rich?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'd struggle with that. I don't know that. Can so if somebody takes their abundance and builds a deck, instead of giving it to their neighbor. I don't. I just. The capitalistic side of me, says of course, like if they don't use their abundance to sort of pleasure themselves somewhat, then they
Yeah.
won't
Yeah.
have any incentive to continue. But
Well, I don't even think it should be incentive because I'll give it. Solomon said there's a time for everything under the sun. Okay, there's a time to work. There's a time to play too. There's times where I remember when I was a teacher, I was working 65, 70 hours a week. That didn't pay squat, so I had to work a second job, which added another 10 to 12 hours. Literally, I did not see my family. I was starting to get health problems and just the strain and the stress of just constantly doing all this work and not playing was literally destroying me. Emotionally, I was depressed, spiritually depressed. Physically, I started having problems like started getting fibromyalgia, all this other craziness going on. And it was terrible. There is times to actually spend money and go go see a different country. And God does, God has created a world that's full of beauty, things to taste, to try, to see, and you're enjoying the world when God's not just austere. You gotta just give and 100% all the time, and we are to enjoy certain things, but I think the way that keeps you from then becoming one of those guys who just thinks of himself is you keep love at the core of things, love of God and love of your fellow man. And that and if you're loving God, you're not worshiping mammon. If you worship mammon, then eventually money is the thing you're actually serving.
yeah,
And that's the thing that you'll then, usually with mammon comes pleasure, everything else, and that becomes the end, and people become just a means to it. It's that type.
well, and that's what I think that a lot of people are. So that's sort of the argument against capitalism. But wait, pause to Michael. Another Michael said just says yes. Build that deck and hire me to stain it. Telos Painters or Telos, what is it called? I think it's Telos Painting in Westmont. If you're in the Westmont area, Telos Painting. Michael Sedgwick is one of the best painters you can find. A good self-made entrepreneur. But I think that's what people worry about when it comes to, not Michael, but when it comes to people that are like me, that are very into capitalism. The danger maybe and the worry is of those that amass and hoard the resources and make and as much make that the idol, make that the ends and the means.
That's always going to happen, though. There's always going to be people who do that. We live in a fallen world, so that's actually where people start at. But again, love has to be the thing that guides us. And I think if we're concerned with those people, if fear is our motivator, think about it. There's certain people who just hoard and hoard and hoard. There's a scripture that says you can hoard goods and wealth to the harm of the owner. Okay? If a guy gets all sorts of money and he hoards it and just spends it all on himself and he doesn't care about, others, then he's actually warping as a human being, not giving thought to God who's above him and not giving thought to his fellow man who's around him. We know where people like that go inevitably if they don't turn from their evil. And so it is to the heart of his owner. There are people who could use those goods and, but it has to be his concern that moves him to give to these people. Loving relationships are founded in such ways sometimes. Like, someone's hurting, and then someone sees you in their hurt, and they have compassion, and they care about you, and they reach down and offer something to help you. And actually, there's even little ways the little guy can help big guys. I mean, it's not like money is the only way you can help someone with. You know,
Right.
yeah,
Yeah, I think that's that's the other thing that I think many of my friends and I mean, I just putting it off on friends, get caught up in is the idea that we can help, what we need, that money is going to solve the problem, right?
yeah,
And, even in John's, discussion with you, he's talking about the failures of our health system and our social programs to help the least of these, and he's not wrong in the sense that we have failed. My contention is that we haven't failed in that we're being too capitalistic or too conservative. I think we failed in the sense that we've come to the point in our society where we believe if we throw enough money at it, the problem will be solved. And what I've seen working in CPS and working at other social programs, the more money you throw at it, the worse it gets. You
tracks
can
all the
throw.
vultures who then go for the money and stuff like that. um,
Unfortunately, yeah.
all right, you said something like, what did you say before that? Something I was going to say and just had a brain fart. Um, you said, oh, the medicine. I feel like the reason it has failed, honestly, is because we do it now for profit. I'm not very comfortable with medicine being a means to make money. Now,
Mm.
let me put a little caveat on this,
Mm.
okay?
Okay.
Because I do know that if you love God and you love your fellow man, that will be a natural bulwark to keep you from overcharging, for looking at people as a means to an end. That will keep you for trying to consider, what's a really truly good means. Like, I can make a living and help these guys. I'm not a burden on them financially. I mean, because I'll give you an example. I've got 7 kids, right? I remember my first child, Emmanuel, when we went we had him over in Highland Park, Illinois. Um, this one doctor walked in, and her last name was Margolis, and Margolis typically is a Greek name. I was like, oh, Margolis. I was like, you're Greek. She goes, no, it's Jewish. I was like, oh, okay, sorry. She goes, is everything okay? And we said, yeah, everything's great. She goes, thanks. She walks out. She's like, let me know if you need anything. When we got the bill, because that's the only time Miss Margolis, and I remembered her because of her name, came in, was then $457 for her to ask how we're doing. I don't even know how a person like that can look themselves in the mirror. Okay.
Well,
I
now,
mean, I'm just like, yeah.
the difficulty with this healthcare system. I mean, this is a completely different subject we could go on forever about, but in a nutshell, the difficulty with our healthcare system isn't that we're not loving enough. It's that we have a stratified system in which when I go to get something done, the bill goes to some dude at a desk who decides how much it's worth and eventually has, because of the insurance situation.
Middlemen who found a
The
way to inject
middleman.
themselves in, and what are they worshiping? Money. They don't care about people.
Well,
There's treatments that they deny you so they can cut the costs and what they have to pay out so they can make profits. That's
well,
terrible.
and I'm not against them trying to make a profit because that's their job. But the evil is not in their trying to make money. The evil is in in the job that they have is evil in the sense that um, it divorces the customer from service. It divorces the patient from paying for, like, directly to the doctor, like, how much is this worth? And the doctor says, well, I'm doing this much work. In order for me to keep doing it, I need this much money. Instead, it's, how much do I owe you? Send your bill to this organization that will take their cut, and eventually it'll get back to me. They'll pay me. And it's the same thing with taxes. The outsourcing of our ministry. And I think you're right. as I'm talking about it, I'm thinking about, um, medical care as a ministry, outsourcing, outsourcing our means to bill and our means to charge to insurance that will cover, you know, they will be able to inflate it to the point where they get their piece and what have you, and pay for those that don't have it. It makes it a smoother system, but eventually it makes it an evil system. I think everybody would agree.
Well, see, this is, I mean, I've given some thought to this whole medical thing, and I agree with John when he talks about how the system has failed. But I really do think that it's greed on all levels. You got doctors that charge way too much. I mean, it's just insane what they charge. When you look at historical stuff, it wasn't like being a doctor meant you were a pauper. You could make a good living even back in the day, 100 years ago. But now it's just like the point is people are going to be a doctor so they can make some money. I mean, and it'll help people, but when you look at some of these bills, I'm just like, oh my good.
Yeah,
like, hold on. When you look at what's done
Yeah.
to what's, I've spent 5 minutes to you just talking to you to prescribe. I'll give you an example. When I was working at Domino's, you had to have a doctor's note for ill. $250. And like, I remember one time I had strep throat. I knew it was strep throat. I looked in the mirror and said, I have strep throat. I need a $5 antibiotic. I need to have a doctor open my mouth and look in and go, yeah, that's strep throat. Give me $250 so I can write a prescription for you for a $5 medication. I mean, it was just is asinine.
I think it's more complicated.
This theft, man. This theft.
I think you're oversimplifying it in the sense that I know a lot of doctors and they're barely getting by because they have to pay so much in insurance. What is it?
Yes.
For litigation.
Yeah. See, this is the thing. Tort. Why? Tort reform, right?
Tort reform,
because
right,
there's
yeah.
people who are suing for astronomical amounts of money. Oh my gosh, this guy did something bad to me, and so I'm going to sue him. If you lost an eye, is $10 million going to make it better? I wouldn't gouge my out for $10 million. If you lost a limb, or I remember one guy, I worked with him at a construction site. He's a preacher, and they gave him the wrong medicine. All right, now bad things. All right, a pharmacist did, and it was starting to have some effects on him, which he eventually found out, and he got big off of it real quick, and he got on his right medication. Things worked itself out. So I know this is dangerous, but no harm, no foul. It's gonna sue him, gonna take it all out. I'm gonna fleece these guys. And it was just like, man, where's grace? There's humanity, there's human factors, like, and a lot of the lawsuits and the litigation, sometimes some of these things are like, are you serious? And I feel it's like making the person, you will pay if you've hurt me in any way, shape, or form. And so inevitably what that boils down is greed and hatred of fellow man. I mean, if you have medical malpractice where a guy is totally intentionally doing evil, but at the same point, I mean, you can't sue them for a gazillion dollars. I mean, they don't even have that. Insurance is in it just to find a way to make money off the game. And a lot of times, I mean, I've seen too many things. Don't get me started in insurance companies, whether it's automobile, whether it be health. These guys, they make their money, and they make it at not paying out. And I see a lot of doctors, and you got politicians and lobbyists and medical groups and pharmaceutical companies that it's all about making money. That's what's the problem. America's problem with the medical system is greed and a lack of love for their fellow man, as rooted in out of their love for God. That's the problem. You can't say that. They're like, but that's the problem. And no government form is going to change that either. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. Socialism's definitely not going to change that.
Socialism's not going to change it.
And that's what I think, we got to go. And so to come back to the idea that, my bottom line is I just don't believe in outsourcing ministry to the least of these. Our ministry to the least of these. I don't believe in outsourcing that to the big global, our national machine we call government, full of millions of people, greedy men and women that need their cut, right? And
Mhm.
that do not know better about my neighbor than I do.
Yeah, you know specifically a lot more on the ground level where they're hurting, sometimes even ways to help. I worked with guys who were poor, but the money that they got, I knew a guy when I was working at Domino's. There was his roommate. The money he got from the government, he used on prostitutes and drugs. You know, whereas the people on the ground who knew it said, "We're not going to give you a blank check. You know, if you need food, we're going to buy you food. If you need help with rent, we'll help with rent and this and that." Whereas the government, they're just like, "You're just number 68532. Do you meet these criteria? And yes, here you go. Everything's all great." Whereas the people actually around them know what, in fact, they're doing. And genuine needs. I've seen sometimes where actually the government hasn't been able to help certain people because you don't meet this and this and this criterion. I'm like, life sometimes isn't so neatly cut to where it fits into a perfect box. And it's like, they need your help. And because this check mark and this check mark ain't checked, you're going to leave them high and dry. And that's terrible. This is where you need people on the ground who can see, as you're saying, you know better what's going on with them. And so you can better help. That's why I think that the church and all
For the
that.
most part, it's ironic because for the most part, it's the privileged. It's the privileged that know how to do, put the right check in the right form, and get the help. It's the underprivileged that are. I mean, part of the reason that sometimes part of the reason is not all the time. Part of the reason they're struggling is because they don't have access to the same sort of knowledge and don't have access to the same sort of experiences that would lead you to be able to know, like, okay, I got to get this form done. I got to get this form done, and I will get the help I need. And either way, it's so much more important for us to reach out to those people physically, relationally, rather than rely on government to do it. And that's
Agreed. I agree.
and there's nowhere I just cannot imagine anybody in the
Uh,
in the New Testament. Well, go ahead. You're gonna
No,
say something.
I'm not opposed to governments helping out. You know, you got a tornado come through, and or like some of these hurricane damages and stuff like that. FEMA, I don't think that's a bad. They're going in to help citizens where
Mhm.
stuff's going on. But I do think that if the government gets too bogged down in social programs, you get what we got now, where we're about to go bankrupt. We're already bankrupt, really. It's only a matter of time before it finally just explodes, and who knows what it's going to look like afterward. But
Well, that's it. Just wanted to bring up. Thanks for joining me, man.
yeah,
And
you're
great,
welcome. I
great
enjoy it.
discussion. I
Yeah,
always enjoy it. And
yeah.
today, as usual, I don't know why it's in a different color. Our podcast is brought to you by Telos Painting. Call 630-550-1959. Ask for Michael. Mike, not Michael Catuzes, but Michael Cedrus. We like Michaels here at Not a Show. All right, brother. Well, I appreciate being able to talk to you about this, and really appreciate your grasp of history and scripture. And let's continue to talk.
Ditto. I'll enjoy it, man. See you next
All right.
week. All right, take care, man.
Thanks, and thanks
Yeah,
everybody for joining us. And yeah, bye.
later.
Just gotta press